We're here with the executive director of Can't Convert Love, Alec Fischer. Alec Fischer, everyone, let's give him a round. So, Alec, you are the executive director of Can't Convert Love, which is a national organization that is fighting gay conversion therapy across the U.S., right?
Correct.
And how old are you?
I will be 22 in November.
And you are an executive director.
Yeah.
I'm barely an executive director of myself. And let me just say my board, which consists of both my parents, is very disappointed in my actions recently. But so you're an executive director with hundreds of people working alongside you in some way, right?
I mean, you could say that in a sense.
I will say that. Were you just some sort of wonder kid who had to have some sort of social justice mission to fulfill, or did some role to be an executive director? Or how did you get involved with Can't Convert Love?
It's a good question. I'm not some wonder kid, don't worry.
Oh.
I'm not going to fly off after this interview. Thank you, I appreciate it.
Close the hole! Close it!
I started Can't Convert Love Minnesota with one of my best friends about 2.5 years ago. And at the time, the national branch was also ongoing, and we were focused specifically in Minnesota, trying to pass legislation to ban conversion therapy in Minnesota. And after 2 years of fighting that fight, I decided to move to the national organization to do more advocacy work.
Okay, awesome. And now you're the executive director, so congratulations. Very quickly moving up the ranks, may I say. So if you're working in Minnesota, do you find that now that you're the national director, do you find that Minnesota is comparatively less homophobic than other states in the union? Because I think a lot of my friends confuse Minnesota with Minneapolis. I'm pretty sure I've heard people be like, yeah, in the state of Minneapolis, this stuff doesn't happen. But is that the case?
I mean, I would say Minneapolis is fairly progressive. The outskirts of Minneapolis and then rural Minnesota are not so much. And it's funny because if you go anywhere outside of Minnesota and outside the Midwest, people assume that Minnesota is corn. And it's like, no, that's Iowa.
Right, we don't have corn here.
We're not that.
We burned it all down.
So, yeah, I think that there's definitely, if you're stuck in Minneapolis, or if you're focused in Minneapolis, you definitely get to see the more progressive side of things, including politics, like we saw with the gay marriage amendment and all of that. But I definitely think the further outside of Minneapolis you go, the more conservative it gets in terms of social issues.
Right, so for a legislative perspective, how do you overcome working with the whole state that might not share the views of the cities that we live in and work in?
It's really interesting because most people that you talk to, whether they're conservative or liberal in their views, actually agree that conversion therapy is something that needs to be banned, especially for minors. Or if they're not sure about where they stand legislation-wise, they agree that it's not something that should be promoted. Most of the conversations that I've had with people most people don't realize that it still exists. Like it's some medieval practice that was, way back when.
Just to be clear, it is a medieval practice. We just still have it.
Yes.
And so what do you think it's going to take to change that? Because I think America, how long has Will and Grace been on? Many years? And people still are homophobic? I don't know how that's possible.
Keep doing more reruns.
Well, we need more reruns. We need more of them.
Get it cycling.
Yeah, get that cycle going. So, but what do you think it's going to take to actually change both perception and laws and politics?
I think the biggest thing, and my parents were this way when I first came out to them as a gay male, I think the biggest thing is people are just scared of what they don't understand. And so the biggest mission that we have is raising awareness that gay people are normal and that they are safe to be around. It's not something that you can cure. And through that, we're trying to empower youth to stand up and say, we're not okay with this practice and you can't cure us. And so I think the biggest thing is just taking people who maybe haven't been introduced to someone who's gay and saying this is okay. They are a normal person, their sexuality doesn't define them. They can use it as a defining piece of their identity, but that's not something that's harmful. And I think that a lot of people who are in support of conversion therapy or sign their kids up for this practice, I think are scared. Because they don't have the information out there that it is something that's normal and it is something that's okay.
Right, so the way we make them not scared is by taking them by the shoulders and yell at them, it's not scary! That's mainly what you do.
Don't volunteer for our.
Oh, okay. I'm also banned from movie theaters and all Six Flags across the US. So your organization has sponsored legislation that has been introduced to the Minnesota House before the legislation that we mentioned earlier, the Protection from Conversion Therapy Act. That's now in committee, I believe, in both the Senate and House, right?
Yeah, well, my friend Gabe and I, who co-founded Minnesota's branch, we actually co-wrote the legislation with legislators. So we were a key piece of moving that forward from its very first stages, which has been really exciting to see. Unfortunately, it's been killed continuously throughout session. And this year, it'll be interesting to see if it gets introduced again, just because with elections and everything, a lot of people are a little iffy on whether or not that'll happen. It's actually humorous to me. The representative from the House who was on the head of the ethics committee who killed our bill the first year we had it. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the makeout case this summer.
My makeout case or someone else's makeout case? Moving on.
Yeah, two House representatives got caught in a makeout case where they were making out with each other and both married, not to each other. Woman who was on the head of the ethics committee that killed our bill without enough information to move it forward was one of those in the process. So apparently we weren't ethical enough for her standards.
Yeah, what you should have done is kissed her husband. And then she would have been like, I trust you. You're a keeper. I'm not endorsing that yet. So what do you think it's actually, like, do you think that our call to action earlier to just contact our representatives across the state of Minnesota is going to be sufficient? Or do we need to do something more? Do we need to, like, drive to their house with a loudspeaker and then yell at them to convince them to support this and pass this bill? Do you think that's...
I mean, you might then be restricted from more places if you want to go that far. But I mean, your list is already growing, so why not start now, you know?
I'm sure by the end of tonight, Minneapolis Television Network on that list as well. But what do you think it's going to take in Minnesota specifically, for that legislation to ban gay conversion therapy to be passed?
I think that's a very complicated question, which rightfully so. There's a lot of pieces that move with legislation and with a movement like this. And that's one of the reasons that I'm moving to the national branch, because something I realized during our lobbying efforts is that this is something that has to take a cultural shift as well as a legislative shift. I think in Minnesota right now you can definitely go to the legislators and ask them to look at the bill and get them moving forward. And that's very important, but I also think more people need to be aware that this practice exists. And I think before we can have people going to the legislators and saying, hey, stop this practice, we need to have people who are aware that it exists who can go and do that. And so that's something that I'm focusing on now with the national branch, is getting a more national movement to happen, to say this is something that's still happening. There's over 30 practicing organizations in Minnesota doing it, and that's just Minnesota. How many across the nation are involved? And it's something that it's going to be a very slow process, but I think if you want to get your megaphone and go to a legislator's house, power to you for that.
I'll do it. I'm volunteering myself. I'm volunteering myself to go to legislative members' houses with a megaphone. To do what again? And so is the organization based in Minneapolis? Or do you have to move? Do you have to leave us?
Yeah, it was originally started by high school students across the U.S. And so we are currently trying to get it filed as a 501c3 in Minneapolis. And so it will be headquartered in Minneapolis for the next couple of years, hopefully. So we will be close. Awesome.
Well, hopefully your work can get this actual legislation passed as soon as possible. And thank you for being here. Alec Fischer, everyone.
Thank you for having me.